Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to AJ507 Ethics in Criminal Justice. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So, this week we're going to talk about Chapter 14, where we're going to take a look at making ethical choices. And, throughout the text, we've explored ethical issues in each of the subsystems, if you will, of the criminal justice system. We have discovered certain themes, at least I believe we have, that kind of run through each of these subsystems, right? And some of the themes would be the presence of authority or power or force or discretion. Some informal subcultures that sometimes are contrary to the formal code of ethics, right? The importance of ethical leadership and tension between some different systems, right? The deontological ethical system and the teleological or means to an end ethical system or analysis. So in this final chapter, okay, because we're at chapter 14, we want to kind of reiterate some of these themes, and we hope to finish up with some last thoughts regarding how to behave in an ethical manner as a criminal justice professional. And we'll kind of review some of the basic themes of the textbook that we've encountered and the path to ethical decision making, as we kind of look at some important ethical issues in our current time, specifically that of terrorism, which is something that really has changed the face of law enforcement and the way that they do things now. After 9/11, things have really changed. So what do we hope to achieve? Well, we want to be able to identify some of the basic themes of the textbook that we've covered. Describe the basic elements of the kind of just war debate and the just means discussion. We're going to take a look at some of the responses to 9/11, explain the human rights model of policing, and then present a method to resolve some of these ethical dilemmas. So again, some of the major themes that we've looked at throughout the book have been authority, power, force, discretion, subculture, and leadership, right? And these are all things that we've kind of talked about. Now, with all that said, let's talk a little bit about just wars and just means. So, on September 11th, 2001, the United States was really changed forever, right? And you may not know where you were because you may not be old enough, but I certainly know exactly where I was and what I was doing when this took place. So the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center was the single most devastating terrorist attack in this country. Over 3,000 deaths and the complete destruction of two buildings that really did stand for kind of icons for capitalism, right? On what could be achieved, etc. And although we had experienced earlier incidents like the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, okay, the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, if you remember the bombing of the federal building, and even the 2000 bombing or missile attack, if you will, of the USS Cole. Nothing really prepared our country for the severity of the attack. And the event basically traumatized a city, affected the American psyche, and led the U.S. military engagement on foreign soil in two countries. It also spurred the dramatic restructuring of federal agencies within the United States. And then I also wanted to point out the 2015 San Bernardino terrorist attack, because that one was extremely close to home, right? So I think we can all kind of relate to that, because a lot of time when we talk about terrorists and terrorist attacks, we always think of it, hey, it happened somewhere else, but we can't really say that anymore. So again, these incidents, and others have led to American military engagement on foreign soil in two countries and spurred the dramatic restructuring of federal agencies. And the war on terror, as we know it, really affects not only the military and federal agencies, but every law enforcement and justice agency in the land is kind of involved. Because again, it changed the way that we actually do things. So it really has spurred a movement. We've also seen, as a result, some, pervasive changes in law enforcement at both the federal and local levels. And the country is still kind of mired in controversy over the responses taken to this, war on terror. And in addition, to the government responses that took place immediately after 9/11, you have Edward Snowden in June of 2013, who exposed the NSA's domestic surveillance activities that showed that the war on terror affected us in ways, that were unseen. Meaning that were there some surveillance things that were taking place, but people didn't know how deep some of that stuff actually was. So again, the controversy over what means are acceptable to terrorism is related to criminal justice ethics, because the war on terror involves not only the military and federal agencies, but it also involves every law enforcement agency and justice agency, because there's a very good chance that we're all going to be involved in this. So in response then to terrorism, there's a prevalence of this means end kind of thinking, meaning the idea that would usually be wrong can be justified to achieve a good end. And we see this argument kind of repeated or repeatedly in the war on terrorism, and surprisingly enough, some people seem to think that it's kind of a new argument, but it isn't, nor is terrorism a new threat. Now, again, there's a really good class if you want to learn all the ins and outs on terrorism, so I'll kind of pitch it right here. It's a good spot. It's AJ507, and it's Introduction to Terrorism and Homeland Security. I teach it online. It's a great class. Yes, because I teach it, but it's a great class anyway, and you can learn a lot more as it relates to terrorism. Okay, so enough of the pitch. Now, what is it? So terrorism has been defined as the deliberate, negligent, or reckless use of force against non-combatants. So it's not like army against army, right? Navy against navy, military against military. It's a deliberate strike, if you will, on those that aren't involved in the combat, non-combatants. Okay, so reckless use of force against non-combatants by state or non-state actors, people, groups, for ideological ends and in the absence of a substantively just legal process, right? So there's no process, at least there doesn't appear to be in this group or this person's eyes, and their ideology tells them, hey, there's no process here, so I'm going to do it this way. So that's one definition. Now, the FBI defines terrorism as, or it includes, and you'll see some things that are, oops, let me go backwards, kind of close, deliberate, negligent, reckless use of force. Terrorism includes the unlawful use of force or violence against any person or property to intimidate or coerce a government, right? Change the government way they do things, the way we live, blah, 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 the civilian population or any segment thereof in furtherance of political objectives. So this is the definition, the working definition that most law enforcement agencies use. They use the FBI definition because usually terrorism is committed by those that have some grudge or whatever. And there's usually some political angle. They want something changed or what have you. Okay, so this is again the FBI definition. And we can look at some things that happened back on 9/11 and really see the impact, right, on what has kind of happened. And again, a couple of different definitions that are out there. But if you take my terrorism class, the AJ517, you'll learn a lot more. So we have, damage to, the Pentagon. We have, the New York City Twin Towers. We have the crash in Pennsylvania. Okay, and then we even have the Boston bombing. So terrorism kind of takes many different forms, etc., including train bombings. So with all of that said, we have to kind of understand that terrorism has led to questions about what is appropriate or ethical in investigative techniques, individual privacy rights vis-a-vis the government, and what is legal and ethical as it relates to the detention and treatment of individuals, right? However, it is important to note that these aren't new questions. From the very earliest philosophers, there has been a struggle to define and agree upon when it is right to, wage war, if you will, and what means are acceptable to secure victory in that. So there's a lot of questions that are kind of looming out there. So what might be appropriate when it comes to investigative techniques? So, again, philosophers have debated the idea of these just wars, if you will, since the time of, Cicero. But the traditional justification for war comes from what we know as natural law. And the second comes from what we know as positivist law. Now, the classical just war theorists, if you will, such as Hugo Grotius, have held that natural law gives sovereigns the right to use force when necessary. There's a couple of examples: to uphold the good of the community, when unjust injuries are inflicted on others, and then to protect the state. Okay, and states are justified to engage in war when any of these events exist. Otherwise, the war is considered unjust and immoral. However, natural law as a justification for war has been kind of criticized because of the likelihood that leaders will use moral arguments to justify wars that are basically initiated for other means. So an example, and there's an example in your textbook, and I can use this one. For instance, some people criticize the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And, President Bush justified it under self-defense because of the alleged presence of weapons of mass destruction, etc. And I'm not going to get into the good, bad, and all the other stuff on that. You could take that AJ117 class and you can learn a lot more. But that would be an example, okay? Now, again, the second more recent justification comes under the positivist law, which is man-made, and kind of understand that, right? And increasingly, this is used as the only legitimate justification for war. Legal incursions into sovereignty of the other nations are justified only under auspicious, or under the kind of auspicious of international law as provided through NATO, the United Nations. So, the problem, though, with the positivist law as the basis for justifying war is that no single authoritative legal body in international relations sits above all sovereigns, and international legal bodies do not include all countries and cover all circumstances. So kind of an interesting thought, but just know the difference between the the two different traditional things, right? We have the the natural law, and then we have the positivist law. Okay, so again, man-made law, and under this positivist kind of thought, the violations must be knowable to all. The violations must be widespread and systematic, and the use of force must save more lives than it injures. So, kind of an example just to cite again, and I'm not on either side of the political coin here, but I'm just giving some examples. If you look back in 2017, President Trump's order to fire missiles at the Syrian air base that delivered poisonous gas to Syrian villagers was widely hailed as humanitarian, basically censure to a horrific and immoral assault. And in this particular discussion, natural law would be used as the justification, right? Now, in contrast, many fear that the United States would not honor the positivist law obligations of NATO, given President Trump's criticism of the agreement. And while positivist law does not provide comprehensive protections against unjust acts of war, using natural law or moral imperative justifications to engage in war can be misused, right? So therefore, limits on moral justifications for war have been proposed. And the limits include the three things that I just kind of talked about. So hopefully that kind of makes a little bit of sense now. Now, a little more to add, and these are not the things that we just saw, the three, these are not too different from other justifications that have been offered by other writers. So, for instance, Crank and Greger in 2005 offer the following justifications for any war. The threat must be grave, lasting, and certain. There are no other means to avert the threat. There must be a good probability of success. And the means must not create greater evil than the threat responded to. So these justifications seem to be kind of consistent, right, with the utilitarian system of ethics, etc. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, even if a military action can be justified by natural or positivist law, the second question is, what means is acceptable in fighting war? Well, under utilitarianism, in determining just means, the extent of harm is weighed against the end or injury averted, just as when one asks, if war is justified. And under ethical formalism, this really does not look at the consequences of an action in order to justify it. So just a couple of different terms and situations for you to look at. Now, another term that kind of comes up would be something called the principle of double effect. And this basically is defined as if one undertakes an action that is good, but that also results in a negative end, if the negative end was not the intent of the actor, the good action and the good end can be still considered good. So that's kind of confusing, right? So again, the concept that means, basically taken for a good end that results in the good end, but also in an inevitable but not unintended bad effect is still considered good or ethical. Principle of double effect. And it kind of sounds even more like a little bit of double talk. But here's an example that might clear it up for you. So if one bombs a military target and innocent people are harmed during the bombing, the act, if otherwise considered ethical, does not become unethical because of the death of the civilians. However, if one intends to bomb a civilian target and does so to instill fear and psychological advantage over the enemy, then that would be immoral because it would be violating the categorical imperative. Okay? So again, and the imperative is if somebody bombs a military target because they're bombing the military target for whatever, for that reason, and, innocent people are hurt, then it's not considered unethical. But if you do it for a different reason, then it can be. So I know it's a little bit confusing, but just kind of hang in there. All right, so with all of that said now, what about our response or the response? So since 9/11, we really have seen a fundamental shift in the goals and missions of law enforcement and public safety. And this shift has included an expansion in the number of law enforcement agencies and personnel, a nationalization and or a militarization of law enforcement, a reduction in civil liberties, and a merging of immigration control and traditional law enforcement. And one of the most dramatic changes after 9/11 has been the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which is kind of an umbrella federal agency that has incorporated many other agencies beneath it. So again, not only have we seen a shift in the goals and the mission of policing, we've seen that new goals include more national law enforcement and a reduction in some civil liberties. And we also have seen a greater emphasis on things like surveillance and crime control, and increasing links between local law enforcement and immigration services and federal law enforcement. So again, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Department of Homeland Security was one of the responses to 9/11, and their mission, if you will, is to secure the nation from the many threats we face. And this requires the dedication of more than 240,000 employees in jobs that range from aviation and border security to emergency response, from cybersecurity to chemical facilities, etc. Because their duties are very wide-ranging, and their goals at the end of the day is to keep America safe. But the question, again, that kind of comes up then would be, well, what means are appropriate to do this? How much invasion of privacy is okay? How much removal of individual rights is okay? Now, we know in order for law enforcement in some places to do their job, you're going to have to give up some rights. I mean, right? You go to the airport, you're going to have to take off your shoes and your belt and pull your laptop out, and things that you never had to do before because that's just what you do. But how far do we go are kind of the looming questions that are out there. And, beyond policing since 9/11, the nation has really been involved in a lot of debates over certain things, and we'll kind of go through these a little bit. But things like detainments, what we call secret prisons or rendition, and I'll define rendition in a minute. Guantanamo Bay, military commissions, the use of, suspected torture, government secrecy, wiretapping, threats to privacy, undercover operations, and other stuff. These are all kind of debates, right? And we kind of have to understand again that we have to give up some of this stuff in order to secure our country, etc. We have to do a certain amount of undercover stuff. We're going to have to be involved in some wiretaps in order to, uncover threats of terrorism, etc. But where are the lines, I guess, would be some of the moral debates in a lot of this. Okay, so immediately after 9/11, hundreds of non-citizens were detained on either immigration charges or material witness warrants. And under the Patriot Act, which you can look up and learn a little bit more about, the Patriot Act required that all individuals on visas report to immigration offices, and many were detained on minor violations of their visa and held for months in federal facilities and county jails without hearings. And that, again, so these are debatable things, right? And names and even the numbers of detainees were kind of withheld for months. And there were deportation hearings, and these were closed to the media and the public. Now, that doesn't mean that none of this was vital or necessary, but again, we're talking about ethical choices. So again, I'm going to kind of ride the fence and let you interpret a lot of this on your own. And one of the things to talk about as it relates to detainments, etc., would be these things called, or this term called, rendition. So rendition is the practice of sending a foreign criminal or terrorist covertly to be interrogated in a country that doesn't have the rigorous regulations and rules for humane treatment of prisoners. And it's usually done with the host country's knowledge, but in some cases without their knowledge. And in researching a lot of this stuff under rendition, if you will, there were things that were discovered, such as secret prisons, right? So these subjects, these individuals that are subject of rendition, taken to countries to be tortured or placed in secret prisons. Now, supposedly these secret prisons were closed, all around everywhere in 2006, but there really is, how would you actually know? But again, the practice of rendition is if you had a terrorist in a certain country and your laws were strict as it relates to coercion, pressure, torture, all of that stuff, you would take them secretively to a country that doesn't have that. And therefore, you could employ some of these other tactics to get them to talk. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. And I will let you kind of be your own judge on whether or not that is acceptable, because we're going to talk about the ticking time bomb scenario in a little bit. And right now you probably think, boy, that's horrible. But when you look at this other situation, maybe you'll change your mind, maybe you won't, but we're going to keep on going. Okay. So again, and this is just a photo outside of, in Washington, D.C., talking about, waiting for justice, because a lot of these individuals that were held and there was no speedy trial, right? And there were even some cases that came out of a lot of this. So when you talk about Guantanamo Bay and the Military Commissions Act, so, soon after the U.S. military initiated, hostilities, if you will, in Afghanistan, the term enemy combatants, and these individuals were captured, and they were described as enemy combatants by definition, were captured and sent to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, a military installation that is considered, American territory. And suspected terrorists were also picked up in other countries and sent to Guantanamo or to these other secret prisons that I talked about. And then the Iraq War began, and these enemy combatants from Iraq were also sent there. Now, the federal government at that time argued that these individuals did not deserve the due process rights granted by the American Constitution because they were not Americans and were not on American soil, and therefore they did not deserve the due process rights granted by the Geneva Conventions. And those, what that is defined as, would be the agreements made by all the world powers, if you will, were after World War II on how to treat prisoners. That's the Geneva Convention. And kind of continuing because they were defined as enemy combatants, so they weren't entitled to due process, right? They're enemy combatants, not soldiers. And this kind of left these detainees in basically legal limbo, where they had no legal protections or due process to determine if they were truly enemies or kind of posed a danger to anyone. And in a series of court cases, the Supreme Court basically came up with some decisions. I'm not going to go over each case, but you can see some cases here. So you have Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, where U.S. citizens could not be held indefinitely without charges, even if they were labeled enemy combatants. Rasul versus Bush, detainees in Guantanamo could challenge their detention in U.S. federal court. Clark versus Martinez, government may not indefinitely detain illegal immigrants without due process. Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, military commissions set up as a type of due process for the detainees were outside the president's power to create and were therefore invalid. So a couple of cases to kind of consider. Now, Congress passed the Military Commissions Act after this case. Hamdan versus Rumsfeld invalidated what they call this presidential decree. And there was some widespread criticism that the act ignored the ancient right, basically, of habeas corpus. And in a case, Boumediene versus Bush, decided in June of 2008, the Supreme Court rejected the military commissions as a due process substitute for federal courts and habeas corpus. Also, the Detainee Treatment Act was not a substitute for habeas corpus. And basically what habeas corpus is where somebody, the agency that's holding someone, is ordered to bring that person forward to be presented to the court, to determine if they're being held in a valid manner, if you will. Okay, is there a reason to hold them? So it's kind of a court order to bring that person forward, if that kind of makes sense, and hopefully it does. Okay, so I'm wondering if we should kind of go forward, or if we should kind of take our first break. But let me kind of give you a little more on the habeas corpus just really quick. So by definition, so that we kind of know, it's a court order, or what we call a writ, all right, requiring a person under arrest or someone being detained to be brought before the court, right, the judge, or into a court, especially to secure the person's release unless lawful grounds are shown for their detention, right? So kind of like I said, but hopefully that spells it out just a little bit better for you. So let's finish this last little part here, and then we'll take our first break. So the next kind of thing on our list would be torture, defined as a deliberate infliction of violence, and through violence, several mental and or physical suffering upon individuals. So, a lot of things that kind of come about when you talk about torture, right? And we know, right, that immediately following 9/11, certain individuals suspected of being involved in the planning of the attacks or being members of Al-Qaeda were basically seized wherever they happened to be and taken to some of these secret locations. And first they were sent to countries such as Egypt and Syria, that basically used torture in interrogations. And then later, they were taken to secret prisons run by the CIA in Eastern Europe. And finally, some were moved to Guantanamo. And, evidently by about 2002, various forms of coercive interrogation techniques were being used at Guantanamo, as well as Bagram prison in Afghanistan and Abu Ghraib in Iraq. And at these locations, subjects were subjected to extreme forms of coercive interrogations, including a lot of different things, right? Subjected to loud noises and extreme heat and cold, deprived of sleep, light, food, and water, bound or forced to stand in painful positions for long periods of time, kept naked and hooded, sexually humiliated, thrown into walls and sometimes slapped, threatened with attack dogs, shackled to the ceiling or kept in small areas, and then finally even waterboarding. So again, I'm not taking a side one way or another on this. I want you to kind of draw your own conclusion, especially when we get to the ticking time bomb and some other different scenarios, to kind of talk about whether or not some of these things are okay or not, depending upon, I guess, the seriousness of what you're discussing. And if you've never seen what waterboarding looks like, basically it's putting something over somebody's over their head and their face and their mouth, etc., and only so much water kind of gets through, but it gives the feeling of drowning and causes you to choke, etc. Okay, a little bit more on torture again, and then we'll stop. Today, there continues to be some support for torture. Look at Pew Research Center, some of the information. The public is kind of split over whether the U.S. should use torture or whether it's acceptable. One report indicated that nearly 2/3 of Americans agreed that torture of terrorism suspects could be, doesn't mean that it would be, but could be justified. So it probably just depends on the situation that you're dealing with. And some justifications could be, again, utilitarianism, the doctrine of necessity, right? Kind of that the doctrine that actions are right if they are useful or for the benefit of the majority. Does torture result in the truth, and does it really even matter? So a lot of things to talk about. And the national argument as to whether torture is legally or ethically justified, is not different from Clockar's discussed article in 1983, where he talks about something called the Dirty Harry problem. And this dilemma originated in a situation from the movie Dirty Harry, if you've ever seen it, where a captured criminal refuses to tell the location of a kidnap victim. And, and Dirty Harry is just Dirty Harry in the movie. And the point is, there really is no good solution in stuff like this. So again, you can read a little bit more on this on pages 443 through 446 in your textbook. All right, we're going to take our first break now. We're going to come back and we'll start with the ticking time bomb.